Well, welcome. Today we have with us for Earth.org the author and scientist, Dr. Jessica Hernandez, who has just written a book which will be coming out today called Growing Papaya Trees, Nurturing Indigenous Roots During Climate Displacement. And very happy to meet you today.
Yeah, Wendell Padici, that's hello in my native language. Thank you for having me here today.
Thanks so much. Now, after reading your book, which I love, by the way, I was very interested to see the fact that Growing Papaya Trees is a highly personal book, but its scope is very much a global topic. So, can I hear a little bit more about your own background and how it relates to the themes of the book?
Mhm. Yeah, so I'm a Maya Chortindinisa woman. So basically, my communities are from Oaxaca and Central America. My father met my mom in Oaxaca when he was escaping the genocide that took place in Central America.
Oh,
And as a result, my family has been displaced. So I think that even though we are displaced and I live in the diaspora, I still have the responsibility to support my communities back home. And one of the ways that I can do that is by uplifting their stories and also talking about the struggles that they still continue to experience even today.
I mean, that's very much something that is important to showcase is when we don't have many people who are actually from a family of climate migrants who are not only from a family of climate migrants, but who are from an indigenous community as well, who can bring both of these aspects to light. And often those two areas of the book are, say, juxtaposed with each other, the greater climate migrant experience and also the greater indigenous experience, whether or not it's related to climate change. And something I was wanting to ask about is you also were the author of a previous book, Fresh Banana Leaves. So what made you decide that a new book was needed?
Mhm. So the first one kind of talks about like displacement, but it also talks about eco-colonialism that we continue to experience as indigenous peoples. It talks about the land theft that took place, in particular in my father's community, so Central America, where we experienced land grabs that were sold to monocultural, international agricultural corporations that displace indigenous peoples. And this book talks more about the climate displacement that takes place, and it kind of centers on my mother's story, especially as a Oaxacan indigenous woman. So in a way, I felt like another book was needed because it's a different perspective, and it also is something that the readers gravitate towards because Fresh Banana Leaves was heavily supported by the community, and there was a need for another book, especially coming from an indigenous perspective that is often dismissed from the global south. I think that it's a great opportunity and privilege to be able to speak and write in English because oftentimes our communities don't speak Spanish and yet alone English. So it's an opportunity to showcase their voices in a different language that basically dominates the world today, the language of English.
That's something that you talk about several times throughout the book as being kind of lumped together with the greater Latinx community or Hispanic community, when in fact you're not even from a Spanish-speaking family. It's as a Oaxacan, it's a completely different, obviously a completely different language as well. And what that means for both you and, for example, in your chapter, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but in your chapter about youth, what that means for young people today and how it you can approach education in a situation where Indigenous people have migrated to places all over the world.
Mhm.
Um, actually, one other point that I was found very interesting in the book was you just now spoke about your father's land being displaced from his land for the purpose of, monoculture. But what we're seeing again is that history rhymes, and yet again we have something you identified called, I think it's called a green colonialism. Was it green colonialism or green capitalism? I can't remember. Um, in which kind of the same thing is happening, but this time it's not monoculture, soybeans or something like that. It's wind farms. Can you tell us about that?
Mhm. So oftentimes when we talk about renewable energy is sold as a climate solution, and I think that that is true, right? Especially as we know fossil fuels are desecrating our lands. But oftentimes when we discuss renewable energy, the nuances that exist where indigenous lands are being desecrated, where indigenous peoples are also being displaced, is rarely talked about. And I think that it's important for us to not necessarily look at climate solutions through a binary lens because, oftentimes we say, oh, fossil fuels are bad, so that means renewable energy is good. But in reality, the way that renewable energy is extracted is not the best ways. And for my communities in Oaxaca, we were sold wind farms as a climate solution, and our communities were excited to have wind farms, especially given that electricity and energy is not necessarily something that many communities, especially indigenous communities, can afford. However, those wind farms have been destroying our ecosystems, have been destroying many habitats. And even though we're still advocating for a better protection of our land, we are seeing the negative impacts that wind farms actually have, not necessarily just on the people, because there is an increase of um crimes that are taking place because oftentimes people see
Mm.
that as an opportunity or space to commit their crimes, but also the destruction of many of our animal and plant relatives homelands. And it's unfortunate that we have to learn the hard way, but in reality, when we look at other countries where these renewable energy sources are being extracted, they're still experiencing the same things on their land.
It's kind of an old story, and it's kind of depressing to see it's happening all over this time with in a new guise. And something you mentioned just a moment ago, which I also found fascinating, is the inclusion several times when you talk about climate migration, is the inclusion of animals. You say to people and animals who migrate, but you made an interesting point about how this is viewed. When people migrate, it's in one way, but animals, tell us more about that.
I think that oftentimes, right, and we can see that migration is a natural phenomenon. It has happened for years, for millennia, even since time immemorial, where even we have historical evidence that indigenous peoples also migrated because we
Mm,
were nomads. We didn't necessarily just stay in one location. However, nowadays, because we have the social political landscape, migration from the humans, especially, us, is seen as something that's criminalized
mhm,
versus migration of animals is seen as something that's beautiful. And we have many activists who have brought that kind of metaphor on how migration of the monarch is
mm,
like a beautiful natural thing that many of us, travel to kind of witness, or even migration of salmon. But yet, when it comes to the migration of humans, we see how people are criminalized and also detained, especially now in the United States. We're seeing how immigration is being used as a weapon to continue to oppress us. And oftentimes it's indigenous peoples who are facing the brunt of that, especially given that we don't necessarily leave our lands because we want to. We are forced
mm.
out of our lands, especially when climate impacts are giving us the no other choice, no options, where we have to make the ultimate sacrifice to leave our land. And I think that oftentimes, even when I talk to my parents, right, they never wanted to leave their land. They were forced out of their land. And as a result, we're seeing that kind of grieving and grief that we witness or experience even today in the diaspora as indigenous people.
There's a line I think you've just quoted, is it nobody wants to become a migrant?
Yeah.
Um, you
Yeah,
know,
that's true.
yeah. Now you are a scientist, but I found this book was as much a policy book and a memoir as it was a science book. Although you do go into a little bit in the energy chapter about, the definition of energy and going into, ATP from a biological point of view. But it covers areas from land rights to renewable energy and, caste systems based on colorism and skin color. So, in which capacity did you approach the overall topic?
Mhm. So I usually approach the topics from an Indigenous science perspective. And I think that the beauty about Indigenous science is that it doesn't necessarily just focus on the Western science. It's more of a holistic framework where we understand that we are all interconnected. Like the Western science is that's connected to animals, migration, climate, displacement, policy. And through the Indigenous science approach, we're able to tell stories that are not necessarily just rooted in being able to understand what's being said, especially you don't necessarily need a Western science degree to understand what's being talked about. And I think that Indigenous science allows us to see topics from a holistic lens as opposed to just focusing on the biological aspects, the chemical aspects. And I would say it's more of an Indigenous science approach because it's more interconnected to everything and allows us to see that, yeah, energy is taught in physics and it's taught in biology, but yet energy is also connected to social political landscapes. And I think
Hmm.
that that's the beauty of indigenous science, that we are able to see everything holistically as opposed to in binary boxes that often Western science puts things in perspective.
You mentioned several times the interconnectedness of all of the issues. So when it's a food issue, but it's not just a food issue because it's an agriculture issue. It's an agriculture, but it's also a forestry issue, but it's also a political issue, but it's also, say, a colorism issue, but it's also a language issue. I think all of these things being connected uh, is an important aspect of what this book shows.
Mhm,
Uh, One of the things that you've mentioned several times, and you wished you've taken care to showcase, is the difficulties of Indigenous people who are forced to leave their lands. And you talk about there being a lot of misconceptions in this area. So talk to me a little bit about those misconceptions and also what is the real situation.
mhm. So I think that even today, right, migration, especially in the United States, because I know in every country is different, it's kind of portrayed as criminals are leaving their countries because they want to kind of come here and commit more crimes, or it's people who want to reach the American dream because they wish to have, the four and family, a family of four, and like the white picket fence and own a home. But I
Mm.
think that oftentimes for Indigenous peoples, especially people from my communities and also my parents, they're forced to leave their homes. They had everything that they wanted back home, like their families, their relatives, their lands, their stories, their cultures, but as a result of climate changes are making it impossible for them to live there, they had to leave their homes, and especially as they had children, as they wanted to support their own parents, especially as their parents got older. But yet those stories are never necessarily portrayed in the media, especially when we talk about migration. That we never talk about the migrants who never wanted to leave their homes, but because of the political turmoil or climate change that's taking place and impacting their livelihoods, they have no choice but to leave. And I think that oftentimes we see how the media also portrays the political landscape and narratives that the country where the media stations are located usually wants to promote. And I think that it's important for us to talk about migration not necessarily being a binary thing where people leave because they're
Mm.
criminals or people leave because they want more money. There's also other nuances that exist that oftentimes people cry when they're leaving their lands because nobody wants to leave their families behind. Nobody wants to leave their parents behind, especially to go to a foreign environment that they have no experience in, that they have no relatives or people that they know living in. And I think that that's important to also showcase, especially in a time and space, especially in the United States, where immigration is heavily criminalized, where we're seeing ICE raids taking place on a daily basis and
Mm.
impacting our communities. And yet, when we talk about migration, those indigenous perspectives and voices are often excluded or dismissed. And it's important, right, to showcase them now more than ever.
Yes, you've mentioned several times I don't think you use this phrase, but I somehow think of it as being doubly silenced. On one hand, as part of a larger, let's say, a larger migration community, but then secondarily or additionally as part of an indigenous community, and again being lumped into this big category. And one of the things you mentioned is the difference between when you just talked about having to leave your family behind and so forth, is the differences between where your family ended up in California, um, the difference in family size and the differences between, say, an indigenous migrants and, say, other types of migrants, particularly the larger Spanish-speaking community. Uh, so can you talk a little bit about those differences?
Mhm. I think the differences is, our cultural structures, especially our languages. Oftentimes, when we do come to the United States, people automatically assume that we speak Spanish.
Mm.
And even for growing up, right, my father never knew how to speak or write Spanish. He kind of learned as I was learning in school, and I think that oftentimes, even growing up in California, right, the bilingual education system believe that all of us, if we were coming from Latin America, we spoke and wrote in Spanish. And as a result,
Mm.
right, I had to learn how to speak and write Spanish and English at the same time. But oftentimes those stories are dismissed And I think that oftentimes, because I think you mentioned it also, right? We're lumped as Hispanic or Latina or
Mm,
Latina, and that's not necessarily that doesn't capture the nuances of identities, especially intersectionality, especially the indigeneity that exists in our communities. And I think that oftentimes it's it's easier for people to put all of us who look a certain way in the box because it's easier to create policies, to create things that target us as opposed to being like, oh wait, they're also indigenous. This means that they have indigenous sovereignty, indigenous rights, but in reality, right, that's not the things that these governments want to do. So I think that it's just for convenience that we're kind of lumped in as Latina, Hispanic, when in reality we are completely different.
Um, it's an interesting thought to consider that the experiences of indigenous communities around the world, although coming from very diverse, disparate backgrounds, might have more in common than again, the larger migrant community. And you take a little bit of a discursion or an excursion in the book, for example, to Palestine. You talk about in Ethiopia. You go to I'd say several other places around the world. Also, I think when you were speaking of the topic of the impact of renewable energy on indigenous communities, you mentioned, of course, the situation of cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And all of these, say, indigenous communities around the world, with who potentially have something in common with each other. Um, will you talk a little bit about what those commonalities might be?
Yeah, I think that oftentimes we always hear the phrase, right? History repeats itself. And I think that when I think of like what happened in Palestine, what I see happening in the Republic of Congo, oftentimes it mimics and parallels what my father experienced, what my people experienced, especially in the
Mm,
1960s through 1996, where it was a genocide targeting indigenous peoples over land. And oftentimes, men decide that they want more power, and oftentimes power equates to owning more land. And as a result, oftentimes we didn't necessarily have much of records, especially photographs or videos taken during that time, especially as cell phones is something new. But
mm,
now in this digital age, we can see, how the genocide impacted Palestinians, how it impacts Congolese folks, especially children. And I think that oftentimes we we can see that for the first time, right? Where history is going to have records of what actually took
mm,
place, depending on, and it doesn't matter what you believe politically, but, you're seeing it, you're witnessing it in images. You're seeing how children are being starved, and you're seeing how children are being kind of forced into slavery so that we can extract cobalt for renewable energy
mm,
sources. And that is something that it's in a way making history repeat itself, but also for the first time showing us documented evidence where everything is digitalized, and as a result, we're seeing voices and hearing voices from the ground that are being impacted by these instances. And I think that it's hard sometimes to even draw hope, especially as a climate scientist or somebody who advocates for climate justice, because you're seeing these things on a daily basis, and yet you feel like one small person that cannot make a difference. But I think that it's important to uplift their stories and make sure that we document those for history to be able to witness, as we know history repeats
mm.
itself.
And indeed, in your father's case, I think as you mentioned, those that kind of record didn't exist. It wasn't possible at the
Mm-hmm.
time, but
Yeah.
just because we didn't see it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Yeah. Mm.
Um, One of the other things you mentioned just now is the relationship of indigenous peoples to the land. And one of the curious things about your book is that throughout the book, you capitalize the word land and lands. And I'd like you to talk about the significance of this.
Mhm. Yeah, so I decided to capitalize lands and lands because oftentimes when we um write land with lowercase, right, we kind of remove the identity the land has. And I think that it's important to mention, right, that lands are our relatives, especially for indigenous peoples, where we are interconnected to our lands. And as a result, we don't view land as something that we can own or commodify. We view land as something that's a part of us, and we are a part of it as well. So capitalizing land kind of personifies that land is indeed our relative, and it's also a human, has the same power or should be equated as humans, right? Like we capitalize
Mm,
our names, but yet when we talk about land, we don't necessarily capitalize it. So I think
mm,
it's in a way kind of giving land the power and respect that it deserves, especially from an indigenous perspective. And I'm seeing that being kind of adopted by other indigenous scholars
Hmm.
or other indigenous peoples where they're starting to capitalize lands as opposed to writing lands in the lowercase. And I think that it shows the importance, right, of lands and also
Hmm.
shows how we can, in a way, bring that importance into writing, right? Because writing
Hmm.
is not necessarily like an indigenous way of telling stories, but
Yeah.
writing is something that we can adapt to fit the indigenous narrative. And that was the way to do that as well.
And in a certain way, it's very much an extension of the concept you talk about several times of the nature being an extension of the self rather than a thing to be exploited. And it reminds me, by the way, of a book that I reviewed a couple of years ago about the world's forests, in which the author of that book mentioned several times that the people who live in the forest don't think of it as a thing. They don't talk about being in
Yeah.
the forest or not in the forest. They say, what are you talking about, in the forest? Um, and that concept of being in the land or owning the land or thinking as a commodity is very much the legacy and the continuing legacy and the continuation of colonialism. And this is an area that you've written about extensively, the legacy of colonialism and the continuous existence of a new kind of colonialism that's happening now. So, what are some examples you could share about this?
Mhm. I think another example that I can share is like the concept of patriarchy, right? Where women are
Mm,
oppressed because we are also seen as commodities, where we're also seen as something that we can own. And I think that it shows it's a beautiful, like a great metaphor, right? Especially in how land is treated, because land is often feminine, given a
mm,
feminine form or identity. And I think that, the way that women have to, we have to fight for our rights, we have to fight or advocate for even our land rights, community rights, like all of our rights to be specific, right? It's like the same way that our Mother Earth has to, in a way, we have to fight for her rights. And I think that
mm.
that's another example on how we can see how colonialism has, introduced this concept of patriarchy that is also manifested in the way that women are treated and also our land, our Mother Earth is
Mm.
treated as well.
Yeah, I mean the phrase you use, the emotional labor of fighting for our rights, and that's, another thing we have to work on the emotional labor to do, along with everything, on top of everything else.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, that leads to the question of policy making. And you talked several times about the inclusion of Indigenous voices in policy making, or rather, the more common scenario, which is that they are excluded. And can you give
Mhm.
some examples of this? And in particular, what are some practical steps that might be taken to remedy this?
So even when we look at, we tie it back to the concept of renewable energy. When renewable energy is extracted, indigenous voices are not necessarily informed or asked for permission. Like I think of like when my community was sold the wind farms, it wasn't necessarily like we had a say. It was like the Mexican
Mm,
government who decided that they wanted to introduce these wind farms, especially in Oaxaca. And I often
mhm,
see that in the Republic of Congo, right, where it wasn't necessarily indigenous peoples who were asked, "Oh, can we extract, you know, cobalt from your lands?" It was like
mm,
the Congolese government who decided to take that into effect. And we see that time and time after, especially when it comes to things that commodify our lands. Like we're never
mhm,
asked for permission. And I think that's important to necessarily center indigenous sovereignty, especially across the global south, because oftentimes when we talk about climate solutions that are coming to the global north, there are kind of being sold as something that is positive. But in reality, indigenous peoples are facing the blunt of those negative impacts that these solutions, right, that were
mhm,
sold in the global north have. And I think that it's important to not necessarily just ask indigenous people for permission, but bring them from the first step, right? When these things
mhm,
are happening. But oftentimes it's all based on money, right? And greed, and oftentimes indigenous peoples are not necessarily consulted at all. And you just get something that you had no say in it, but now because the government decided to sign an agreement, your communities have to abide by it, or otherwise,
mhm.
there is oppression that exists or suppression that takes place in our land, from the government being
And
enacted against.
I'm sure that often because the of the ownership of the media by the people in positions of power, I'm guessing we don't see in the mainstream media or even in minority media, quite often we don't see what's actually happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is true. And I still am looking to find media sources, right, that often find give us that critique or that critical lens that we need. Because I think that, not everything is like black or white, not everything is good or bad, but there are nuances that as people, right, being able to receive the media should be able to define for ourselves. But oftentimes we see that the media is very, as you mentioned, it fits a certain narrative and often it's the
Hmm.
narrative of in power.
Hmm. Um, no, moving to a different topic. You know that I think last week or the week before, the new Second Eat Lancet report last week, which is about the future of food systems and the relationship of food to the planet. Something spoken about in that report is the PhD, the planetary health diet. And something that struck me when I read it was it was a tiny thing, but it was the importance of starchy tubers other than white potatoes. And I thought, where do you find those? Why, guess what? It's in the global South. And
Mhm.
of course, in particular, the homeland of potatoes. But it was an interesting point for me to see again how there is an unexplored relationship between the indigenous world and the food systems that we have that are dominant in today's global diet. So, what can we learn from the global South, from the indigenous world, about food and what food is now and what maybe it ought to be in another scenario?
Okay. So when I read that report, I one of the things that actually like it reminded me of was the milpas. And milpas are just basically this holistic agricultural system that we have in the global south where it's kind of like planting the three sisters, corn, squash, and beans.
Hmm.
And it's a way, it's oftentimes like study in permaculture because it's not a system that requires much human labor or pesticides even or any chemicals to sustain itself. And milpas are able to sustain our food systems from our protein because animals live in this milpa to also our plants, like squash, beans, and other plants that we also have. But as a result, right, it kind of reminded me of how indigenous agricultural systems are not necessarily harmful for the environment, and also they do not necessarily require a lot of man labor
Mm.
or man-made chemicals to be able to sustain themselves. However, because of climate change, right, we're seeing heavy floods or rain kind of flood these milpas or destroy them. The droughts are destroying them. But in a way, it kind of reminded me of that, where indigenous agricultural systems have been able to sustain themselves without much man labor, but yet they're not necessarily what we practice, right? Because they take
Hmm.
time. They're not, you cannot use GMOs, the genetically modified chemicals to make them grow larger. They're just natural, but it kind of reminded me of that. And it's, it showcases how indigenous science, right, has the solutions for climate change or even the problems that colonialism has introduced, yet oftentimes we are not necessarily included as solutions, but rather as afterthoughts.
Mm. I think it's all about yields when we talk about monoculture, when we talk about
Yeah.
modern food system, and never about quality.
Mhm.
Mm. Now, coming back to food, the name of the book is Growing Papaya Trees. So, why did you choose papaya as the unifying metaphor for the entire book?
Mhm. I chose papayas because they are native to my lands, especially my communities, and also because, in a way, you also kind of see papayas in the United States sometimes, and I think that is a great metaphor to showcase that as Indigenous peoples, we might be displaced from our lands, yet we don't lose our identity, we don't lose our roots. Our roots are just expanded, and also papayas have always been a symbolism in my family that kind of always allowed my mom to reminisce of her childhood and also
Mm.
her home. It also reminds me of like, spending time with my grandmother in Oaxaca and back in their lands. And in a way, it's like a metaphor, right? It's like symbolism of what indigenous peoples are. We are resilient because papayas are one of the, most resilient kind of fruits out there, especially because
Mm.
we have so many seeds and also, we do experience a lot of weather conditions, but it's just a showcasing of like how as Indigenous peoples, there is this notion of people either love us or hate us, similar to papayas, right? And it was
Hmm.
interesting to read more about papayas, right? Because every time people are asked, "Do you like papayas?" They're always it's a very polarizing fruit, right? People either love it
Hmm.
or hate it, and I think that is also a great symbolism for us as Indigenous people start this place, right? Because you either hate migraines or you are in favor of migraines, and that's how we are seen as papayas in a way as Indigenous people in the.
All right. Well, thank you very much. The book is Growing Papaya Trees, Nurturing Indigenous Roots During Climate Displacement. The author is Dr. Jessica Hernandez. And thank you very much, Dr. Hernandez, for being with us today. And I look forward to seeing your book on the shelves all over the world.
Fabiucci, gracias. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks so much.